Well, we'll begin by talking about the Semele myth, and we could just try and reconstruct the story. We were trying to work it out backstage. It's complicated, isn't it?
Well,
it's important.
Semele is an interesting character. We were just illegally chatting about this in the green room. We're not supposed to talk until we actually got on stage. But it's a very interesting myth that goes in Greek culture is mentioned as early as Homer and the so-called Homeric hymns. Semele is a Theban princess who is courted by Zeus, and the sort of we all know that Zeus has a great penchant for women other than his wife, and she is one of those, and she is goaded in some versions by Hera, the wife of Zeus, to demand of Zeus that he reveal himself to her in his actual divine form, which is pure fire. You know, as I'm sure you know, Zeus likes to take on different forms when seducing different women in different myths. My favorite being a shower of gold in the myth of Danae, and you think, well, it's an easy way to get into the room, but what do you do afterward? And then because so she's goaded by Hera to insist on this. Hera knows, of course, that if Zeus appears to a mortal in his pure fiery form, that the mortal will be incinerated, which is in fact what happens. And so that's the sort of basic structure of the myth, and it's dealt with by different authors in different
She's pregnant when she is
ways. But the most weird aspect of it, because Semele becomes the mother of Dionysus, the god of wine and theater, and the weirdest aspect of the story is she's pregnant when this happens, and miscarries this fetus, whom Zeus then snatches up from the ashes of his girlfriend and sews into an opening that he makes in his thigh and brings the baby to term sewn into his own thigh. And that baby is Dionysus, and you can understand why he had problems in adult life. And so that's basically the bizarre genesis of Dionysus, but it's a very interesting myth, and it does go back, it is an old myth. This thing about the fire is already, the being incinerated is already mentioned in Pindar, so that's going back pretty far.
And so as a consequence of the myth, we get theatre. We got Dionysus, and we get the god of theatre in a way. But what do you think the myth reveals as such, as a kind of paradigm of a myth? Because we get different versions of it. Semele longs for immortality. Right? She wants the condition of immortality, divinity. She's mortal. She longs for something she can't have. And that would seem to be a structure that you find not just in this myth, but in other myths. So is there something indicative about the Semele myth that reveals something about the structure of myth?
Well, it's, as all good myths do, it seems to be overloaded with possibilities of interpretation. I mean, that's well, I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point, but I mean, that's what myth does. It's a kind of framework to which you can sort of add meanings. But it seems to me that, the sort of interesting thing about Semele, I think, is twofold. First of all, I think it's about desire,
right?
Actually, that you always want more from your lover. How much of your lover is there to be squeezed out, right? There's always another level you want to go to that ultimately ends up being self-destructive, or not self-destructive, destructive. And I've just begun to think of this myth as a kind of paradigm for the limits of desire, how much you can know the other person, right? How well can you really know your lover? There's always some essence that you want to get after. So there's that possibility. I think, and we've sort of briefly talked about this or exchanged some emails about this, but I think that the Semele myth is particularly interesting to me because, you could say that one of the things that myth does is it's a way of explaining the universe, right? You have to think back to the earliest sort of instantiation of myth when there's sort of, Greek cavemen sitting around a fire or whatever they did. And, so you have to explain like why there are seasons, why there's winter. It's a good question right now. I would like to write a new myth in which Persephone stays in the underworld for 9 months instead of only 6 months. So you could see how myths evolved as a kind of way of explaining natural phenomena, blah, blah, blah. That's one theory, right? And what seems to me interesting about Semele is that it seems to be a kind of meta-myth about myth. In other words, that the desire to sort of get at the pure essence of the world, is ultimately almost impossible, that you need some kind of mediating thing, stories, narratives, myths, whatever, to explain the world, or science, or whatever. But the idea that, to sort of go after the absolute essence of creation is somehow dangerous, I think is a feeling that, or a kind of a cultural feeling that expresses itself both formally and informally. We were talking about this. So it's like those old horror movies where somebody says, there are things that man was not meant to know. And I think in some way that's what the Semele myth is sort of, that's one way of maybe thinking about it.
It's about going back to the first interpretation about desire. I mean, it begins with a wedding, her wedding, or the nuptials for her wedding to Athamas, who she's not very keen on, and who kind of fawns on her, because she wants the god. She wants Jove.
Yeah.
And when she has Jove, she's really, really happy. Endless joy, endless love. Semele enjoys above. It's kind of like that. And she, so it's about transgression of limits, about desire as desire pushing towards something which you shouldn't go after and which will finally destroy you. And there's something about that in relationship to other myths, we could say, which would be, in the program notes, because I mentioned this is all conceived by this Chinese visual artist, Zhang Huan. And that's in many ways the whole framing of the production, as if you've seen it or as you will see it, occurs in a temple, an ancestral temple. There's a story of murder and intrigue. But it's in very much he's infusing that myth with that. It's being reimagined in this different way. But the question there then is about unknowability of myth, what myth pushes towards, and that whether, if we think about other ways of thinking about Semele, or what Semele reveals, two examples come to mind. The myth of Empedocles, and these program notes he talks about the core of Semele is monstrosity, he says. Monstrosity, that's the word I was thinking. And monstrosity is somehow bound up with this transgression of the human and the divine. That the person, the mortal that wants to become immortal becomes monstrous, becomes other. And we can think about this in relationship to there's the great German poet Hölderlin, who defines the essence of the tragic as the monstrous, as the coupling of the human and the god. And he's thinking about Empedocles, the mortal philosopher who wants to commune with nature and did that through incinerating himself in Mount Etna. Or in a different way with Oedipus, in a way. Oedipus is about desire, it's about limits, it's about a certain pushing beyond. So is there something about myth, which is, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because Oedipus is also about knowledge, right? It's famously a myth about knowledge. Where do I come from, right? That's the interesting part about the Oedipus myth. And in fact, the ancient Greeks etymologized the name of Oedipus in two different ways, but one of which is the Eid of Oedipus is the Greek word to know, right? And pous or pu means where. So some, of these sort of false etymologies that came out over the centuries was that the name of Oedipus means I know where, right? as in, I know where I come from, but of course the joke is he doesn't know where he
Right.
comes from. So it's interesting, as you're talking about Empedocles and Semele and Oedipus, that so much of myth is obsessed with, or Greek myth at least, is obsessed with the limits of knowledge, right? How much can you know? And that's very interesting because, of course, what myth wants to do is explain things, right? So it's as if built into myth is its own awareness of its limitations, so to speak, right? There's only so much that you can explain in some way. I wonder if that's why so many myths are about the limits of knowledge, about people who destroy themselves trying to find out the answer to the ultimate question.
Yes. I mean, I want to go on to, later on as we develop this, into the question of whether, well, the first question about the persistence of myth. You talk about that in Waiting for the Barbarians and elsewhere, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a view which is very common, which is that we live in a kind of post-mythological condition. Mythology was something which was the Greeks had, antiquity has, and the modern world is a world without myths. And it seems to be more complicated than that, right? We seem to be endlessly inventing myths. But just stay with the Greeks to begin with. Do you think, I mean, it's a stupid question, but did the Greeks believe in their myths?
Well, that's actually the title of a book, a very interesting book. I think my own sense is probably in this roughly similar to what has happened to Western European culture since the Middle Ages, is that people stopped believing in them literally, increasingly, but for whatever reason continued to value the usefulness of religious myths after people stopped believing in the content. I mean, that's my general feeling about the Greeks. And of course, one of the things that happens in Greece, or at least in Athens, and it's always important to remember that Athens is not all of Greece, but still, is that the genre of tragedy arises, and there's 100 years in which basically the sort of primary literary activity in one of the most important cities in the world is retelling myths as dramas, right? So did they believe them literally? I don't know, but clearly they were thinking about them enough that they kept going to see these plays, which are just dramatizations of these famous myths, and also not only dramatizations, but the important thing to remember about myth, and I'm reminded of this in talking about Greek tragedy, is that one of the great differences between Greek myth and, say, our religious stories is that Greek myth was much more fluid and plastic than our religious stories, which are encoded in a couple of important books, right? Whereas the Greeks were always rewriting their own myths and playing with them, and there were different endings, and and I think that's important. As we talk here about myth, it's important to remember that myth for the Greeks was a system that was very fluid, right? So there are versions to take the Oedipus story. We know one version, which tends to be the version. It's funny, we were talking before. When they were doing the sound test, I said, every time I wear one of these mics, I feel like Madonna, and I want to start singing like a virgin. So clearly, it's on my mind.
You can.
No, but we tend to know the version of Sophocles, but there were other versions floating around. For example, Euripides has a play in which, after the revelation of the incest and all of that, Jocasta does not kill herself, but she's sort of still floating around the palace 20 years later. So I think it's very there's a whole myth about Troy where Helen doesn't actually run away with Paris. That's just an imposter. And the real Helen is good and faithful. And so
she goes to Egypt, right?
She goes to Egypt, as one does. And so I think that it's very important to remember that myth was a kind of a playground in a way that we sometimes forget, we want the book where it tells, like, we want Edith Hamilton to tell us what the myth was. I don't think the Greeks thought like that at all.
And also we want to, there's a view which is a very common view. I mean, there's a great book by Bernard Williams called Shame and Necessity, where he begins by saying there's a belief that the Greeks were very exotic people. Namely, the Greeks were not like us. We are these secular creatures that are full of doubt and all the rest. And the Greeks were something else, and they believed their myths, they believed their stories. And that's not at all clear, I think. There's a huge premise in that, which I think that the plasticity of myth, that's very important. But also, as we were talking about before, if we think about tragedy, we also should think about opera here. But in relation to tragedy, we get these myths, these stories, which are plastic, on the one hand, as the stories of the city, or the stories. On the other hand, we get those stories told in relationship to a new regime, a regime of logos, of law, of the democratic city, a basically secular order. Mm-hmm. And so what we find in tragedy is a kind of disjunction between the order of myth and the new, as it were, the new world of the democratic city. And that would lead one to think that, well, these stories, these are our stories, these are the stories that there are, but they're not, as it were, believed in a kind of gullible way. They're the stories which continue to shape who we are. And I think that would be rather similar to the way we use myths, no?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that one of the most interesting theories about Greek tragedy as a genre in the past generation or so was one that suggested that, the problem, so to speak, for the Athenian democracy was that all of their stories were about great aristocrats, basically. The whole mythic system, going back to Homer, is about these great princes who go to Troy. So, what do you do with those people? What do you do with Achilles when you're trying to promote democratic values, so to speak? Right? What do you do with a character like Achilles, who's so selfish and who is so not group-oriented, to put it mildly? Right? He tanks the whole Trojan War just because he's been dissed. So, so one of the sort of interesting theories about tragedy is that because tragedy is the product of the democratic state, right, in Athens in the 5th century, basically, is that it's a kind of a place to question, to sort of adapt the old myths to a democratic political environment, to sort of work out how badly we need those people. Maybe a better way of talking about this or illustrating this is to say, we were talking about this just now, we do need myths, we do use myths, we do have myths. And I was thinking about this a lot a couple of years ago when I was writing this thing about the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination.
I was going to bring that up.
If there is, I can't think of a better example than the Kennedys of how however secularized our society may be, we still evidently feel a kind of a profound need for a certain limited number of families that you can keep telling stories about, and whose lives seem to enact, you're the philosopher, not me, but to seem to enact, basic problems about life, right? So if fate,
doom,
curses, all these words that come up when we talk about the Kennedys, it's completely pre-modern, it's amazing. And so, we may tell ourselves that we've evolved a lot, but I think, to use them as the most famous example, clearly we who think of ourselves as secular, democratic, all the things, or many of the things that the Athenians thought about themselves, still have an obsession with these sort of glamorous, doomed characters.
Right.
And I think so, what I'm trying to say is that in some way, very roughly speaking, obviously, but, the Kennedys are for our polity, the American polity, what Achilles was for the Athenians. You need these people to tell stories about, right? You're too beautiful, you're too successful, you're too rich, something terrible is going to happen to you. We all say it, or at least if you grew up in a Jewish family like I did, you said it all the time, right? But the point is, it's an incredibly primitive way of thinking when you think about it, and yet the Kennedys seem to embody that, and so we latch onto them. So clearly there's a need to have the stories of these people, real or imagined, sort of be about something that we need to say to ourselves about the way the world works.
Which raises this sort of profound question in myth between, as it were, aristocracy and democracy.
Yeah.
In many ways, or nobility and normality.
Yeah.
It seems that we cannot. Democracy is something which seems to be difficult to sustain without these myths of noble houses, the House of Atreus or the House of the Kennedys,
Yes.
which are defined by a curse, a backstory, a sense of doom, a sense of grandeur, and there's also part of this, and this question I want to raise. This is kind of a suspicion I have: is that why do we enjoy those stories so much? Why do we enjoy those stories of doom in relationship to the Kennedys so much? Is there a kind of sickness that we have that we want glamour, we want nobility, but we also want doom, a curse, and failure?
Well, I think I want to go first talk about this very interesting point you raised about the politics, right? And every time I read People magazine, which I, of course, regularly do at the supermarket checkout counter, pretending that I'm looking for the Encyclopedia Britannica. I think, and I see that phrase, Hollywood royalty. Right? I'm very fascinated by this because I do think we have an atavistic need to the only way I can express it is to say for glamour. The characters in Greek myths provided that for the Greeks. Achilles is dangerous but glamorous, right? These people are beautiful, they're powerful, they have an aura of magnificence about them. And clearly, human beings sort of need people like that, whether you're reading the Iliad or you're reading Paris Match or Hello magazine and reading some story about, what hat the Queen of England wore, to cut a ribbon somewhere. And you think, why does anyone care about these preposterous people, right? But obviously, we do need there to be figures like this, whether they're actresses, the Queen of England, all of these things. And I think that's
that. But there's also in your piece on the Kennedys, and you make the equation between Bobby Kennedy and Hector, rather than Achilles. There's the Achillean, as it were, glamour, right? The sort of robust individualist that doesn't really give a damn. But then Bobby Kennedy, you define in relation to Hector as the figure who's defined by duty, who tries to hold it all together, and who is overcome by disaster.
Right. And this goes to one of the things about myth that's useful. If you talk about why we still have myths, right, is that the characters in myths seem to be sort of reduced essences of the kinds of people that there are in the world. So you're an Achilles type or you're a Hector type, right? And that's one of the reasons we like myth, because it hands us these sort of archetypes ready-made, and you can slot people into that. So I wanted to make that point because I see, every time somebody says, "Oh, we're post-mythological," I say, read People magazine. You might as well be reading the Iliad. We have a hunger for people like that.
Yeah.
And I think to come back to your second point, which I think is so interesting about democracy, it's a problem in a democracy where everyone is supposed to be the same, right, or at least have the same value. Right? But we know, because life is like that isn't true, that there's always someone who's more glamorous, more, better at sports, this, that, the other. And so we have to, as a democratic culture, and I think the Athenians were struggling in the same way, which is why they kept writing plays about these wacky characters, we're struggling to balance the communal aspect of a democratic culture in which everyone is technically the same, with the inbred, it seems, human need to admire great figures.
Yes.
Right? Because even in democracies, there has to be a leader, and that's automatically a problem. So you have to tell stories about these people, right? That's, I mean, it's funny, we're talking about mythic families, the Atriids or the whatever, and now we have the Clintons and the Bushes. Mm-hmm. But we still have someone.
It's nobility of
right?
a certain kind. There's a desperate need for nobility.
Yeah.
And tragedy is the imitation, it's the fall of a noble character.
And that's why I think when we talk about we think of the words we use, political dynasties, all of these things. It's very regressive, and then we want to slot them into myths, and that's, I think, the Kennedys are just the greatest example of that.
Which brings me to Titanic.
One of my favorite subjects, as you
know,
yes, from reading my book.
Because there's a as it were, a deep epistemological question here.
About the Titanic.
About the Titanic, but let me go through my notes to find out. You remember your quasi-uncle made you a member of the Titanic?
Enthusiasts of America.
Enthusiasts of America.
The TEA, as we call it.
Okay. Titanic Enthusiasts of America. And the Titanic happened, and it's become mythical, and we know that. And you write about that brilliantly in Waiting with the Barbarians. But as you also say, there was the sinking of the Lusitania, right? An equally terrible tragedy in many ways, but it did not become a myth. So what makes certain things, so now we're on to the question of modern myth and the links between modern myth and ancient myth, which we've been emphasizing, but what makes a modern myth a myth? And why are some things forgotten, which are horrible things, and why do some things become mythical?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think that, I was writing this piece for The New Yorker for the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic a couple of years ago, and, I was faced with the question of why is the Titanic still culturally irresistible, 100 years later, and it still seems to be about something, right? Other boats sank in more terrible ways or whatever, but there's something about this one, and my answer as a classicist is that it seems to dramatize, it seems mythic, right? It has the quality of myth, and this will sort of maybe help us to sort of keep narrowing down what we think myth is and what it's good for, right? Is that the Lusitania sinks with a terrible loss of life and very glamorous people on board, Vanderbilts and Whitneys and whatever, probably a more glamorous passenger list than the Titanic. But the Titanic, we can't stop making movies about, so why is that? And I think it's because the Titanic seems to be about the universe in a way that the Lusitania is not. Or, as we were maybe suggesting before when we were chatting, the Lusitania is history, but the Titanic is myth, right? So what do I mean by that? It's the biggest, most beautiful ship ever built, and they say it's unsinkable. Well, so of course it has to sink, right? I mean, to go back to that primitive way of thinking, right? If you say, oh, this God himself could not sink this ship, that we file under hubris, right? That great overweening human arrogance that the gods love to zap every now and then, right? So okay, it's about hubris, right? That's the oldest one in the book. But the number of elements of the story, every good tragedy makes you feel. It's just funny. I was just teaching a seminar on tragedy last semester, so I'm filled with this. But every time you watch the Oedipus or the Bacchae, you keep thinking, this time he's going to do the right thing, right? He's going to figure it out and behave, and it's all going to end up right. One of the interesting things about dramatized myth is it always gives you the sense of near possibility. That's why you keep going to see it, right? It's not like you know, once you know the story, you stop caring, right? We know these stories, we endlessly know them, and yet we can't stop looking at them. And the Titanic has exactly that quality. That sort, you know, you keep thinking, this time somebody's going to say, you know, maybe we should only be going 5 miles an hour instead of 85 miles an hour. You know, you keep thinking that. So there seems to be something about myth that dramatizes truths we believe in, right? That if, what is the Titanic about? If you're too big for your britches, something bad is going to happen. That's basically what the story is about at some level, with a lot of other ancillary stories. So it does that, but it also, I want to say, myth is always about bad decisions in some way, and how you respond to them. And it invites a kind of participation. You want these people to make better decisions than they actually do.
Yeah, but don't we enjoy people screwing up? We enjoy watching people screw up.
You know, it's a wonderful book called Why Does Tragedy Give Us Pleasure?
Exactly. Why does tragedy give us pleasure? It's slightly sick. In relation to the Kennedy assassination, people watch the same news footage over and over again. There's something immensely reassuring about that. And there's also within the Kennedy story, and this is something, you know, the word mythos in Greek is plot as well. And there's also a link between myth and plot, and plotting and conspiracy, and those things. We want conspiracy. That's also something immensely reassuring.
Well, right, and it was funny because, I mean, like most people, I know something about the JFK story, but until I was working on this story, I had no idea how crazy people are.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just off the charts. But it's interesting for our purposes because, you know, why, when we talk about a conspiracy theorist, right, you're basically talking about a person with a mythic way of thinking, right? That the universe is against you. And if you dig enough, you will show the malevolent system that is the universe, right? That's what, and so when something actually happens in the world, in history, an attractive young president with a pretty wife is shot in broad daylight by one guy. When you have the mythic mentality, you're going to take this, and if your particular myth happens to be the universe is plotting against me, then it's a perfect storm, right? And so it feeds, the structure of the story feeds the fantasies, right? That there's got to be more, there's got to be more. Well, look, we're back in Semele territory.
Right.
She wanted more, and she got it.
Got it, and we enjoy watching her be incinerated.
Right, but I think that may be another aspect of...
We're not educated by it. We're not, as it were, left with a sort of elevated catharsis and purification of emotions, are we?
But does catharsis have to be elevated? I think catharsis is pretty low. You know? It's like, that's an interesting question, right? I never thought of that before, but I think one of the things we get out of myth, so on the one, maybe there's two possibilities. It's instructive, right? It says this is the way the world is. Or maybe it's like better, you know, it should happen to them than to me, right? That's catharsis at its lowest sort of high school cafeteria level, right? You know, so I love listening to these stories because these are stories about terrible things happening to people who are not me, right? And that, I mean, certainly that's one thing that drama and opera also, to bring this round to tonight's entertainment, right? Opera is a modern sort of instantiate. Look, opera was created very self-consciously as an attempt to emulate Greek tragedy.
Yes, 1597.
Right? So why do you always think, you know, people... I have a friend in the audience tonight who was recently bitten by the opera bug, and so, which I was bitten by many decades ago. But, you know, you think, why do you spend all this money and time watching these women die? It's crazy, actually. But, you know, and there's a lot, you know, when I was working on my dissertation 25 years ago, there was a lot of work being done at the time about both opera and tragedy, which is trying to answer that question, you know, why does the culture find it good to put it in crude terms, to keep staging the suicides of women. Like,
Right.
what is the patriarchy getting off on by staging this thing? And obviously, I just gave you the answer, which is that culture is patriarchal, and so it keeps wanting to show stories of women who push too hard and then they're dead at the end of the play, right? So that was one sort of thing that was in the air. But, so there are many reasons why we enjoy these, and often for reasons we're not aware of. Right? What is the pleasure of going to see Madame Butterfly for the 50th time? Well, some people will tell you that it's a patriarchal pleasure.
I think that's
not just the pretty music.
Yes. But how about, there's another, because if we have the view, which I think we both have, that the lines separating antiquity from modernity are not as hard and fast as one may imagine. It's not as if the Greeks were these exotic people and here we are, secular moderns. They were quite like us in many ways, with similar kinds of questions, different conditions, obviously. So if we think about, it's not that we're living in a post-mythic condition, we need myth. We've thought about that, and the Kennedys provide that. Another, you mentioned Hollywood, but another area where there's been a kind of location of where myth is happening. And this leads me to another. My question is, how do you separate good from bad myth? Because it seems to me that if we think about recent television series, The Wire most famously, True Detective, various things like that, which are mobilizing what you call in one passage Aeschylean moral textures. There's an Aeschylean moral texture to these things. And what's driving that is a deep sense of inevitability, of fate, of human beings trapped in a certain situation, which is going to play out. We know how it's going to play out, and we watch it play out. But those are myths. There's a mythic structure there, but a mythic structure in relationship to specific historical conditions, in the case of The Wire, say, Baltimore and over the last 20 years or whatever. Now, what about that? And we'd say, let's say that's a good myth. How do we distinguish between that, or can we distinguish between that and a sort of a crappy melodramatic use of myth, or 300 or something like that?
Well, it's interesting that as you're talking, I'm thinking of so many things. So one of which is you're talking about The Wire, and then I was thinking about Sopranos, and then I was thinking about The Godfather. It's interesting that we keep wanting to, we always want to put a family at the center.
Yes.
That is an interesting sort of mythic impulse. I think the good myths are the ones that have the sort of clean lineaments that of a parable, right? So, we could tell you what the Semele myth is in a sentence, basically. If it's too complicated, it stops being useful. Because what a myth ultimately gives you is a kind of a punchline that tells you something about how the world works, right? So, that's why there aren't that many myths.
Right, but also something about who you are.
Actually.
Why, for example, Oedipus is, I'm teaching Hamlet this semester, and why is Hamlet a play with such force? It's an inversion of the Oedipus story, right?
Yeah.
Because it's something which internally one can feel as an inevitability, right? In terms of one's desire, the organization of the family, kinship, all that stuff. And it's that, it seems to be an aspect of myth is necessity, fate, which we can attach to the universe, and that's more or less good, but we can certainly attach to our private lives and the feeling that we're playing something out, which has been played before.
Yes. Yes, I think that's true. But it's also interesting, one of the things we haven't talked about, is that we are all post-Freudian, right? But one is, so we, and you could argue, and certainly Freud liked to use myths.
Absolutely.
Right? So you could argue that one of the achievements of modern civilization has been to sort of personalize myth, right? To take mythic structures like the Oedipus story, a guy who sleeps with his mother, and to have it be about the psyche, right, rather than civilization or whatever. This is one of the things that's happened to myth. It's very hard to teach the Oedipus, by the way, because of course we are all psychoanalytical now.
Yeah.
And so we always want it to be psychoanalytical. And I always have to remind my students that, to think about the play that Sophocles wrote, you have to sort of try to imagine what the world was like before psychology, psychoanalysis. In fact, the Greeks thought that if you dreamed that you slept with your mother, it didn't mean that you had weird neurotic hang-ups, but that you would make a lot of money. Right? So, myths, the stories may be the same, but the interpretations change a lot,
Right. So. Join me in thanking Daniel Mendelsohn.